In the winter of 1876, guard James Wickham heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Every morning at dawn, as the first light crept through the barred windows of Belford State Prison in Michigan, a soft whisper would travel through the water pipes. The message was always the same, a name followed by 3 words that made his blood run cold. He dies today. Before we dive into the terrifying truth behind these whispers, I need to ask you to do something for me. If you're enjoying this dark mystery, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Also, I'm curious, what city and country are you listening from? Leave it in the comments below. Your support helps us bring you more of these chilling stories that most people would rather forget. Now, let me tell you about a prison where death had a schedule, and the only warning came through rusted pipes in the early morning hours. Among the old records and whispered accounts that have survived from that harsh winter of 1876, the story of Belford Prison emerged as one of the most disturbing tales of institutional corruption ever documented in the American penal system. Belford State Prison sat like a gray monument to despair in the industrial heart of Michigan, just outside the growing city of Detroit. Built in 1863 to house the increasing number of criminals from the rapidly expanding industrial towns, the prison was designed to hold 400 inmates, but by 1876 housed nearly 600 men in conditions that would make the devil himself weep. The prison was a testament to the harsh realities of post-Civil War America. 3 stories of solid limestone blocks rose from the frozen ground, surrounded by walls 20 feet high, topped with iron spikes. The structure was divided into 4 cell blocks, each connected by a network of heating pipes and water lines that snaked through the walls like metal veins. These pipes, installed hastily during the prison's construction, would carry more than just water and steam. They would become the lifeline for men living under the shadow of death. Guard James Wickham was a man of 32 years, a Civil War veteran who had seen his share of death on the battlefields of Virginia. He had taken the position at Belford not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Jobs were scarce for former soldiers, and the prison offered steady pay of $18 a month. Wickham was known among his fellow guards as a fair man, one who followed the rules but didn't take pleasure in the suffering of others. The prison was run by Warden Cornelius Belford, a man whose name the institution bore not out of honor, but because his family had invested heavily in its construction. Belford was a thin, severe man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of every human soul he encountered. He had been appointed to his position through political connections rather than any experience in corrections, and he ran the prison like a business, one where the primary concern was profit, not justice. The prisoners themselves were a mix of petty thieves, con men, murderers, and those unfortunate enough to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Among them were men like Thomas Brennan, a former Irish immigrant who had been sentenced to 10 years for armed robbery, and Samuel Hayes, a young man from a wealthy Detroit family who had been convicted of embezzlement. These men, from vastly different backgrounds, would find themselves united by a common enemy and a shared desire to survive. The winter of 1876 was particularly brutal in Michigan. Snow fell in heavy sheets, and the temperature dropped so low that the water in the prison's pipes would freeze solid for hours at a time. It was during these frozen mornings that the whispers began, traveling through the metal conduits like ghostly messages from beyond. The first whisper James Wickham heard came on a Tuesday morning in January, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the prison walls. He was making his rounds through cell block C when he heard it, a soft, barely audible voice coming from somewhere within the walls themselves. "Murphy," the voice whispered, followed by the chilling words, "He dies today." Wickham stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively moving to the club hanging from his belt. The voice seemed to come from the heating pipes that ran along the ceiling, but that was impossible. The pipes were sealed and carried only steam and water. He dismissed it as his imagination, the result of too many sleepless nights and the constant tension of working in such a place. But later that afternoon, Patrick Murphy, a prisoner serving time for theft, was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, a heart attack, according to the prison physician, Dr. Elias Crenshaw. But Murphy had been a young man, barely 25 years old, and as healthy as any man could be in such conditions. Wickham felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Michigan winter. The next morning, the whisper came again. This time the name was Rodriguez, and again, the same 3 words followed. Wickham listened more carefully this time, pressing his ear against the cold metal of the pipes. The voice was definitely coming from within the plumbing system, but how was that possible? Sure enough, by evening, Manuel Rodriguez, a prisoner convicted of assault, was dead. This time, the cause was listed as accidental death. He had supposedly fallen down a flight of stairs and broken his neck. But Rodriguez had been a careful man, one who had served 3 years without incident. The other guards began to notice Wickham's strange behavior, the way he would stop and listen whenever he passed the pipes. When he tried to tell them about the whispers, they laughed and suggested he was hearing things. The stress of the job, they said, could make a man imagine all sorts of things. But Wickham knew what he was hearing was real. The whispers came every morning at dawn, just as the pipes began to warm and expand after the cold night. And with each whisper came a death, as predictable as the sunrise itself. The prisoners, too, began to notice the pattern. They would exchange glances when someone's name was mentioned in hushed tones, and by the 3rd death, a palpable fear had settled over the entire prison. Men who had faced bullets and knives on the streets of Detroit now cowered in their cells, wondering if their name would be next to echo through the pipes. As the deaths continued through the winter months, a strange ritual developed within the prison walls. Each morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the barred windows, the prisoners would listen intently to the pipes. Those who heard their names would spend the day in a state of panic, knowing that death was coming, but not knowing how or when. The fear was so intense that some prisoners began to refuse food, believing that poison was the method of execution. Others would not leave their cells, thinking that an accident was being planned. But death came anyway, in ways that seemed random and unfortunate to those who didn't know the truth. James Wickham began to keep a journal, documenting each whisper and each subsequent death. The pattern was unmistakable. The whispers never lied. In 3 months, 14 prisoners had died, each one preceded by the morning message through the pipes. The deaths were varied in their apparent causes: heart attacks, falls, fights with other prisoners, and even one case of apparent suicide. But Wickham noticed something else. All of the dead prisoners had one thing in common. They were either troublemakers who had caused problems for the prison administration, or they were men from wealthy families who had been convicted of crimes that brought shame to their lineage. The guard began to suspect that the whispers were not supernatural warnings, but rather a communication system being used by the prisoners themselves. But who was sending the messages, and how did they know when someone was going to die? His investigation led him to spend more time among the prisoners, listening to their conversations and watching their behavior. He noticed that certain inmates, particularly the older ones who had been in the prison for several years, seemed to have a network of communication that extended throughout the facility. Thomas Brennan, the Irish immigrant, was one such prisoner. He had been in Belford for 4 years and knew every guard, every routine, and every secret passage in the building. When Wickham approached him carefully, Brennan was initially suspicious, but something in the guard's demeanor suggested that he might be different from the others. "You're hearing the pipes, aren't you?" Brennan asked quietly one evening as Wickham passed his cell. "You're hearing the morning messages?" Wickham nodded, his hand gripping the bars of Brennan's cell. "How is it possible? How do you know when someone is going to die?" Brennan looked around nervously, then leaned closer to the bars. "Because they're not dying natural deaths, Guard Wickham. They're being murdered. And the only way we can protect each other is to warn them when their time has come." The revelation that the deaths were murders rather than accidents sent a chill through Wickham's spine. That night he could hardly sleep, his mind racing with questions about how such a system could operate within the prison walls. The next morning, he positioned himself near the pipes earlier than usual, determined to understand how the communication system worked. As dawn broke, he heard the familiar whisper, but this time he was close enough to trace its source. The voice was coming from cell block A, traveling through the water pipes that connected all 4 sections of the prison. He followed the sound, moving quietly through the corridors until he reached the cell of an elderly prisoner named Abraham Thorne. Thorne was a man in his 60s, serving a life sentence for murder, and he had been in Belford since the day it opened. When Wickham approached his cell, he found the old man kneeling by the exposed pipe that ran along the floor. "I know you're there, guard," Thorne said without looking up. "I know you've been listening to our morning prayers." "Prayers?" Wickham asked, confused. Thorne finally turned to face him, his weathered face bearing the marks of years in captivity. "That's what we call them. Prayers for the dead. Because that's all we can do for them. Warn them that their time has come." Over the following days, Wickham pieced together the truth about the whisper system. It was a network of long-term prisoners who had learned to communicate through the prison's pipe system. The pipes carried sound remarkably well when the metal was cold and contracted, creating a natural speaking tube that connected different parts of the prison. But the most disturbing revelation was how they knew when someone was going to die. The prisoners had discovered that the deaths were not random. They were being orchestrated by Warden Belford himself in collaboration with certain guards and the prison physician, Dr. Crenshaw. The system worked like this. Families of wealthy prisoners would approach Belford with offers of money to expedite their relative's death, saving them from the shame of having a criminal in the family. Additionally, prisoners who caused too much trouble or who had learned too much about the corruption within the prison would be marked for elimination. The actual murders were carried out through various methods designed to look like accidents or natural causes. Dr. Crenshaw would administer poison disguised as medicine, guards would arrange accidents during work details, and fights would be staged between prisoners to eliminate targets. The Whisper Network had developed as the only form of resistance available to the prisoners. By monitoring the guards' conversations and observing patterns in the prison routine, certain inmates could predict when a death was planned. They would then use the pipe system to send warnings, giving the intended victim a chance to prepare, or, in some cases, to escape their fate. Armed with this knowledge, Wickham faced a terrible choice. He could report what he had learned to the authorities, but Belford had powerful political connections, and it would be Wickham's word against that of the warden. More likely, he would simply become another victim of the murder system. Alternatively, he could try to work within the system to protect the prisoners, but that would make him complicit in the corruption. The weight of the decision pressed down on him as he continued his daily rounds, hearing the whispers each morning, and knowing that each one meant another human being was marked for death. The decision was made for him when he heard his own name whispered through the pipes one cold February morning. "Wickham," the voice said, followed by the familiar 3 words that had become a death sentence. "He dies today." Panic seized him as he realized that his investigation had been discovered. Someone had informed Belford that he was getting too close to the truth, and now he was marked for elimination. The irony was not lost on him. The very system he had been trying to understand was now warning him of his own impending death. He immediately sought out Thomas Brennan, who had become his unofficial contact within the prisoner network. Brennan's face was grim when Wickham told him about the morning whisper. "They know you know," Brennan said simply. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Wickham had until nightfall to figure out a plan. The usual method for eliminating troublesome guards was to arrange an accident during the night shift, when there were fewer witnesses. He could try to flee, but that would only confirm his guilt in Belford's eyes and might result in retaliation against the prisoners who had helped him. Instead, he decided to take a desperate gamble. He would use the whisper system himself to expose the entire conspiracy. That evening, as the pipes began to cool and contract, Wickham made his way to the basement of the prison where the main water lines converged. He had learned from watching the prisoners that this was the best location to send messages throughout the entire facility. Speaking directly into the main pipe, he began to tell the story of the murder system, how Belford was taking money from wealthy families to kill their criminal relatives. how troublesome prisoners were being eliminated, and how the prison physician was using poison to make the deaths appear natural. His voice traveled through the pipes to every cell block, reaching not only the prisoners, but also the guards who were stationed throughout the facility. Some of the guards were complicit in the system, but others, like Wickham, were simply trying to do their jobs and had no knowledge of the conspiracy. The reaction to Wickham's revelation was immediate and chaotic. Prisoners began shouting and banging on their cell doors, demanding justice for their murdered friends. Guards who had been kept in the dark about the conspiracy confronted their colleagues, leading to fights and confusion throughout the prison. In the midst of this chaos, Warden Belford appeared in the basement, accompanied by Dr. Crenshaw and two of his most trusted guards. They had come to silence Wickham permanently, but they found him ready for them. "You've made a terrible mistake, Guard Wickham," Belford said, his voice cold and menacing. "You've interfered with matters that are far beyond your understanding." "I understand perfectly," Wickham replied, his hand on his weapon. "I understand that you're a murderer who's been selling death to the highest bidder." Belford laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "You think you're some kind of hero? These men are criminals, the dregs of society. Their deaths serve a purpose. They clean up the mess that our legal system has failed to address properly." "And what about the money?" Wickham challenged. "What about the payments from wealthy families who want to erase their shame?" "That's simply good business," Dr. Crenshaw interjected. "We provide a service that benefits everyone. The families get their peace of mind, the prison gets funding for improvements, and society gets rid of its undesirable elements." The confrontation might have ended in Wickham's death if not for the intervention of the prisoners themselves. Led by Thomas Brennan and Abraham Thorne, they had managed to break out of their cells during the chaos and had surrounded the basement. The corruption had been exposed, and they were not going to allow another murder to take place. In the ensuing struggle, Dr. Crenshaw was killed when he tried to inject Wickham with a lethal dose of poison. Belford and his corrupt guards were overpowered and held captive by the prisoners until outside authorities could be summoned. The investigation that followed Wickham's exposure of the murder system revealed the full extent of the corruption at Belford State Prison. Records found in the warden's office showed that over the course of 3 years, 42 prisoners had been murdered for various reasons, some for money, others for convenience. The whisper system had saved countless lives by warning intended victims, but it had also been a desperate measure born out of the prisoners' complete lack of other options. The men who had organized the communication network were not hardened criminals seeking revenge, but human beings trying to protect each other in an impossible situation. Warden Cornelius Belford was tried and convicted of multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to death and executed in the same prison where he had orchestrated so many killings. Dr. Elias Crenshaw's death was ruled justifiable homicide, given the circumstances of his attempt to murder Wickham. The prison itself was completely restructured, with new leadership and oversight designed to prevent such corruption from ever occurring again. The pipe system was modified so that it could no longer be used for communication, though some say that on cold mornings, if you listen carefully, you can still hear whispers echoing through the metal. James Wickham left the prison service after the investigation concluded, haunted by the knowledge of how close he had come to death, and by the memory of all the warnings he had heard too late to save those who had already died. He spent the remainder of his life as an advocate for prison reform, working to ensure that the horrors of Belford would never be repeated. The story of Belford State Prison serves as a reminder of what can happen when power is corrupted and when human life is treated as a commodity to be bought and sold. The whispers through the pipes were not supernatural phenomena, but the desperate communications of men fighting for their lives in a system designed to destroy them. In the end, it was not the law or the authorities who brought justice to Belford. It was the courage of one guard who chose to listen to the whispers and the determination of prisoners who refused to let their friends die in silence. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest places, humanity can prevail, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is simply the willingness to speak the truth, even when that truth travels through cold metal pipes in the early morning hours. What do you think about this story? Could such a system of institutional murder really have existed in 19th century America? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark tale from our nation's past, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story like this. Until next time, remember that the truth has a way of echoing through the years, just like those whispers through the pipes at dawn.